Mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. I'm sure that you've heard of the idea of giving our first fruits back to God, perhaps in the context of stewardship or pledging even. It's one way that people often talk about the practice of tithing or giving 10% of one's income to God's work through the church. But what does first fruits giving really mean in its original biblical context? Here's how the book of Deuteronomy explains it in an extended passage from the 26th chapter. Buckle your seatbelts. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and shall put it in a basket and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, "Today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us." When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. "A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow down before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house." Here ends the reading. Now, what's so interesting to me about this passage is how the giving of the first fruits of the land is intimately connected with gratitude for the land and for God's gift of the land. Each person who brings an offering of first fruits makes this same declaration at the altar of the Lord, recounting the difficult history of the Israelites, culminating with the Lord bringing them into a land flowing with milk and honey. In its biblical context, then, first fruits giving is all about gratitude. Gratitude for the land, gratitude for the produce of the land, and gratitude to God after so many years in the wilderness. Today, in both our readings from 1 Kings and our reading from the Gospel of Mark, however, we witness examples not of people giving their first fruits, but instead giving their last bread. In 1 Kings, we see the widow of Zarephath making a cake out of her last bits of meal and oil and giving it to the prophet Elijah. In Mark, we meet another widow who puts 2 copper coins into the temple treasury. The text tells us that this is all that she had to live on. And widows, of course, often experienced significant economic vulnerability in biblical times. And in both of these biblical narratives, we witness widows being commended for giving the last of what they had, for giving their last bread. Now, to most of us, this kind of giving likely seems foolish, even irresponsible, certainly not something to be commended. And to our modern minds, it seems inappropriate that the Bible would laud these widows for risking their personal well-being. Yes, these passages are meant to demonstrate a profound trust in God for one's daily bread. And yet, such seemingly naive trust goes against almost everything we've been taught about how the world works. Indeed, we've been taught to repeat this mantra almost religiously. Put on your own mask first before assisting others. So what are we to make of these women who offer their last bread? Are we called to this kind of radical trust too? Are we meant to emulate this kind of giving? I think most of us brush off this kind of extremism in giving as something irrelevant to our modern times. And yet, as I've reflected on these passages, I've been thinking about other ways that this same kind of thinking shows up in our lives. If you read my tidings article this week, and I hope you will, you'll have learned about a series of injuries I experienced over the course of my first few years living in Pennsylvania. At one point, as part of my rehabilitation efforts, I joined a small group training program at my gym. I was new to lifting free weights, and I didn't yet know that overdoing things at the gym would eventually cause me additional injuries. I remember my trainer when I thought I couldn't do any more reps, when I was shaking and fearful that I would soon drop the weights, telling me to do one more, telling me to push beyond what I thought was empty. You've got one more in there, don't you? Come on, let's go. You've got this. I almost always found one more, and it felt good. My trainer was proud of me, which made me proud of myself. And yet I would eventually face consequences for believing that I could always do one more, for believing that more was always better. Because sometimes giving more, doing more, well, sometimes it can be harmful. And this was a hard lesson for me because I had always thought that more was more was more, that giving to the last drop could never be a bad choice. Here's another way of thinking about it, about giving one's last bread. I'm guessing that, like me, you have had times in your life when you feel that you have nothing left to give. Times when you felt depleted, empty, depressed. Times when it's been difficult to muster the energy to give much of anything to anyone. But I wonder if you've also had this experience, that sometimes when you've acknowledged how empty you feel, embracing the reality that you have nothing left to offer, sometimes something shifts, something changes. Sometimes you are gifted a moment of reprieve, an infusion of energy, a ray of hope. And suddenly you are, at least momentarily, returned to the land of the living. Suddenly you have something to give again. This something usually feels like it's coming from outside of you rather than from within. This something feels like grace. This something is not even your last bread. Rather, it is bread from heaven. It is manna in the wilderness. To our very great surprise, we are replenished from some mysterious bounty. And rather than begrudgingly giving our last bread, it feels as if we are, in fact, giving our first fruits. And so the only fitting response is, of course, gratitude. Gratitude to a God who can enter into our wilderness and bring us into the land of milk and honey. And so perhaps rather than giving until it hurts, we might consider that sometimes when we hurt, God will instead give us something to give. We won't give because we're grateful. We'll be grateful because we've been able to give. We'll be grateful because the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders, and brought us into this place. a land flowing with milk and honey. And we are grateful because our last bread has become our first fruit. May it be so. Amen.